Okay, we are live. Sorry for the delay. Had a little bit of a technical problem. I had to kind of run off anyway, so we're starting a little bit later than usual, than expected. But today on the show, I have David Smith. He comes to us from Tennessee. I saw his name after being on the Biblical Hitman with Matisse, and I saw that he had done a show on Puharich, which I listened to. I listened to it on the Biblical Hitman. I have not covered this guy, Henry Puharich, or he goes by Andrija or Andrija. That's his kind of nickname. But I read a lot today, and I've kind of been prepping for this because I think it's an interesting topic, right? Post war, World War II. But there's a lot of ways we can go with this interesting character. And he's right there, kind of like pre MK Ultra, but doing a lot of parapolitical stuff with a lot of interesting characters. Dave Smith, by the way, operates the Hemispheric Press, so people check that out. I'll put a link to his Substack, excuse me, and people can check out. He's trying to publish books or is publishing books, so you can check out that Substack. But again, we're going to talk about this guy Andrija Puharich, who I have a bunch of slides and things like that. But the real question of what he's really up to me is very questionable. But Dave can talk more about that. So, Dave, welcome to the show.
I'm very happy to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, so for people who hadn't heard you, maybe not heard the Biblical Hitman, maybe you can talk about your background, your research, your publishing endeavors, and then we can get into this interesting guy. Like maybe we can just start off with a simple bio of Andrija Puharich.
Yeah, absolutely. My background, I guess I studied in school. So I went to college and studied kind of the CIA's activities in Central America. And so I was kind of in this mainstream historical research trajectory. But then, when you start, I was especially interested in Guatemala. And so I looked at a United Fruit Company, which was down there, which ended up becoming Chiquita Banana. I looked at the CIA-sponsored coup of the Guatemalan president who wanted to kind of nationalize their agricultural industry. CIA overthrew him and then sparked kind of the civil war that happened in Guatemala that, lasted for over 30 years and, had a genocide in it. And through the process of studying that, like when you get into the CIA, I started to definitely trend towards the more kind of parapolitical. So since then, I've always been interested in kind of the history of drugs. And so the government research into LSD, mescaline, mushrooms, was very fascinating to me. And, kind of through that, that's how I came into, awareness of Andrija Puharich. Other than that, I mean, we have a podcast called Bad Press that my friend Trevor and I do. He has another podcast that he does as well. But we, kind of look at a lot of these, we did kind of a series on Jeffrey Epstein. Recently, we did Puharich. I've been talking about some of the other research I've been doing. Then we have that Substack, Hemispheric Press, and we're looking to publish authors. We've published a couple of Trevor's books, and I'm an editor. I really like working with different authors and writers like that. So that's where you can kind of find me or some of our other work. As for Puharich, kind of starting off with a bio. He is, this kind of mad scientist, this emphasis on the scientist in the early part of his career, emphasis on the mad in the latter part of his career. His story just gets tangled in all of these different webs, and especially when you get into kind of parapolitics, you begin to see kind of the connections that run through it. But he was involved with everything from the Round Table Foundation, which was made up of a bunch of blue blood American families who were interested in extrasensory perception. And the Round Table Foundation would go on to channel 9 alien beings that they referred to as the Nine. And the Nine would become a very influential force on Puharich. He would very quickly, kind of after that work with the Round Table Foundation, he ended up working for the Army / CIA at Edgewood Arsenal down in Fort Detrick. and that's where he was formerly working with the CIA. He was working on Project Artichoke, bleeds into MK Ultra, kind of the line between those two programs, depending upon who you talk to. Some say that Artichoke led into MK Ultra. Some said that Artichoke was, completely separate and stayed separate. But regardless, he was working on mind control programs, and he was working on narco hypnosis. So he was, trying to access what Peter Levenda calls the land of memory. So they were trying to basically kind of hack or sabotage the brain, to kind of serve their purposes. I'm sure, most of your listeners are familiar with the mind control programs. So he's formally involved with that. A couple years later, he is traveling around. He's looking for different hallucinogenic drugs. So at this point, they haven't found psilocybin yet. I think Wasson is right on the verge of publishing that Life article that introduces psilocybin mushrooms to the United States. He's got his friends at the Roundtable Foundation are looking into Amanita muscaria in Maine. And so he's working a lot with kind of these drugs and their impact on consciousness. He goes on down to Brazil in the 60s to visit this Brazilian healer that was, his name was Arigal, and he would do like crazy things like insert a rusty knife and remove a tumor, and the person would, magically be healed. So he was kind of this strange healer that Puharich went down to see and saw him live and was just captivated by this guy. And then after he gets done down in Brazil, he brings Uri Geller to the United States. And Uri Geller, of course, is the kind of the famous psychic / magician. Different opinions on Geller and his reported abilities. But Puharich is the one that brings him over to the Stanford Research Institute and introduces him to Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, and the guys that were getting into the psychic spy, launching kind of the psychic spy program. And so he's first and foremost interested in ESP. That was what Puharich started out like in his early career. He became a doctor, became a neurologist to explore the possibility of the existence of, things like being psychic and telekinesis and, extrasensory perception in general. And so
parapsychology is the word, maybe.
Yeah, parapsychology for sure. And that was at a time where it was like, parapsychology was not as laughed out of the door, by the mainstream as it was today. There were like definitely people willing to listen, to kind of his theories, who were, kind of very high up in academia and stuff like that. And he carries that interest all the way. He is interested in that, being utilized by the CIA. So he kind of gives briefings to various intelligence agencies about, the weaponization of ESP and parapsychology. And so he's kind of at the forefront of what you end up seeing in the 70s and 80s, kind of with that psychic spy program. And so after he brings Uri to the United States, he publishes the book Uri, which is probably, why most people would have heard of Puharich if they, kind of, weren't as invested in research into these kinds of things. But he published the book Uri, and he was trying to gain respect for parapsychology and ESP, the study of ESP in general. But the book did the complete opposite. And so it kind of, makes a laughing stock out of Puharich and Uri Geller. Uri Geller distances himself. Puharich goes and starts what's called Lab 9 in Ossining, and it's a strange place. He's actually, through Lab 9, he gets involved with Gene Roddenberry, who, is the creator of Star Trek. And so you see some parallels between Puharich's kind of belief in the Nine and some of what shows up in Star Trek. But he was also running like a psychic kids camp, is probably the best way to describe it. And so he has, and this is very, red flags should be, raised immediately, considering all of the, mind control type of activities he was working for the CIA. So, I mean, there aren't like, I don't think too many documented cases of like horrible abuse at the camp, but there are very questionable practices. Like he was trying to have kids remote view the Kremlin. So he's doing all of this crazy stuff. He's in upstate New York. And then the house gets burned to the ground. He thinks it's the CIA. He might have been right. And then he kind of trails off into relative obscurity. I did find one interesting anecdote. Like after all of this happens, he shows up on Geraldo Rivera's radio show back in like the 80s. And he claimed to have been involved in a mind control intelligence program of the Navy, and he calls it Project Penguin. And this would have been in 1947, so that's actually really important timing if he was involved in something like that. But no one can find anything about Project Penguin, and they think that it's I think that's at least the opinion of Recluse, a parapolitical research, is that he may have meant Project Pelican, which actually was that kind of program that the Navy ran in 1947. So other than that, like you said, there are a ton of different directions that you can kind of go, but that's just a brief kind of sketch outline of the things Puharich was getting into.
But they're all very deep. Like he's writing books. This is an intelligent guy with a lot of backing. He wrote books like Wasson about psilocybin or whatever. And I think that famous article was published by Life magazine in 1957. Seeking the Magic Mushroom by Gordon Wasson. And that was like religifying the drugs, right? So it was like the beginning of this kind of counterculture. It's a known fact that Puharich or Wasson is MK Ultra. It's subproject 59. So this is like culture creation, which puts Puharich in a different light as far as I'm concerned. But it's I also see him that I didn't know until I started researching, but I see him in the same kind of place as Leary, who's like in Middlebrook and doing all this other stuff. He's like an early Leary, actually, where they had like elite support and a big, campus, and people would come to the campus, and they're doing all kinds of new age research and drugs. And that's what Puharich was doing some pretty advanced stuff. Like I've got some pretty interesting Faraday cages, right? So he put people in an environment, I think it was all copper or something like that, to make sure there was no external stimuli or something like that. Like, I think he was at a place called Maine, right? It was in Maine, if I remember.
Yeah, it was in Camden, Maine.
Camden, Maine, right? So it's on the coast, kind of south of Bangor, I think, central coastal Maine, yeah.
Yeah, very wealthy community. And that's what we'll kind of see. So yeah, I mean, he was brilliant. And that's why when I was like kind of described him as this mad scientist, like emphasis on the scientist in the first part of his career, I mean, by all accounts, he was brilliant. I mean, he grew up in Chicago. He was the son of immigrants from, I believe, Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, he's Croatian. He's ethnically a Croat, I think, if I remember.
Okay. Yeah, I think, that rings a bell. And his parents immigrated to the United States a few years before he was born. But I mean, he's, grows up, poor, working class, and he ends up getting a scholarship to Northwestern, where he studies philosophy and pre-med, and he gets his medical degree from Northwestern to become a neurologist. And he is interested in electrobiology, and he's interested in like how the electromagnetic spectrum of other organisms and of the earth and of space, the electromagnetic field, broadly speaking, interacts with our brains. And so he believed that our brains could perceive this electromagnetic frequency, but that it was, kind of difficult to pick up on, like we had, that you kind of had to train for it, or that there were some people that were more talented at perceiving it than others. But he believed in this sixth sense. And he had an experience as a child where it was like he was delivering milk for the Borden Dairy Corporation. And he was on his bicycle and he went to drop the milk off. And like while he was walking away, there was a German Shepherd that looked like it wanted to attack him. And so he looks at the German Shepherd and he tries to send basically calming vibes to the German Shepherd. Like he's intently focusing, into like staring into the eyes of the German Shepherd and telling the dog to calm down. And the dog did. And so he took that and, he tried to make it, take a scientific approach to it and say, kind of what happens with that. So that's just like one anecdote. There's a ton of different, reasons that
he had something like 50 patents. He was one of the first kind of guys, like they were doing that research. One component of the mind control research was kind of voice to skull or hidden influence on the psychology of the human being where the human being wouldn't know it, right? And I think he was really involved in that. And some of his patents are online. They're really something else. Like, look, this is one. Have you seen any of them?
Yeah, I haven't seen the patents, but I know of a few. So he started a company that was about like putting implant devices.
Right. This
like
is like MK Ultra, Timothy McVeigh stuff.
Yeah, he designed a tooth that could receive a radio signal. Yeah, that's the one right there.
Yeah.
And he did that pretty early. And he
filed 1958.
Yeah. And that's what I mean. And he was doing that research originally with the Roundtable Foundation in the early 50s. There were a couple guys. So there was one guy who made radio receivers using like piezoelectric crystals in Maine that he links up with. And then there was another guy who's like really interested in cybernetics and the Macy Foundation and the interface between, human minds and technology. There was a guy, in New York at the time that he was visiting. I think that guy's last name was McCullough, but he was also involved and interested in cybernetics, and that is known as a conduit for MK Ultra funding. And so, yes, he was because, you get Cameron, was it Ewan Cameron, Dr. Cameron, who's known as like the psychic driving guy who was working in Canada, was doing extremely similar things, putting voices in the pillows of the, quote unquote. I mean, they were victims. He was putting, terrible.
They never disclosed how bad it was at McGill. It was really, 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 really bad. And this is like a guy going down the river at the same time as Puharich. Like I don't know if he was being as naughty as Cameron, but like he's doing the same stuff. He's actually involved in hypnosis. That's a really interesting element of Puharich, is that he's a master inductor. What he would do is induce these people, and that's how they would talk to the so-called nine, is through like a hypnotic induction. But this like voice to skull stuff, just mind-blowing. This is just one of his patents. 58, very much in detail. You can see the whole thing. His name's right there on the top. Means for aiding hearing. That's the cover story. It's a hearing aid.
Well, that's what they and I think it's like the guy who he was working with gets credited for, inventing this kind of hearing aid, but the practical applications of what they were doing, and you start to see, it begins to make you think of like when you start to see these voices, like you were questioning of like, okay, well, is he a charlatan? Is he being like, how nefarious is he? And one of the questions for me is like, okay, so how ardently does he actually believe in the nine, or is he, doing things like taking people's teeth out of their head and then, saying that they're channeling,
replacing, or is he like really at the forefront of creating false memories? Like, is the whole nine thing fake? There's a lot of books. He has a lot of books and he has a lot of discussion. The nine sound to me, I read some of them. They sound like, you ever hear of Casey or some of these other channeled books? It sounds like that. Like, there's going to be this huge event, guys, cataclysm, and then you got to really watch out. And these are the steps you take. So it's like fear of like world ending that never happened. Like it's just they didn't have that kind. They didn't play out in the real world, in my opinion. But that's the way it sounded to me. I don't know if you read through that stuff, but this is like some of his hemispheric brain waves and stuff. These are pretty advanced for the time. Crazy, yeah. Method of an apparatus for inducing desired states of consciousness.
Yeah.
So through technical means,
Yeah, kind of like the hemisync, some of the stuff that would come through that. But he got it. Like he was taking very seriously by the medical profession and the wider scientific community when he came out of Northwestern. I mean, he worked at Kaiser Permanente over in California, and
Oakland, I think.
yeah, he was doing his residency there, and he was studying there even at this point in his career, which would have been like right around late 40s, really early 50s. He was studying the effects of drugs on the brain, and he was, kind of studying effects of drugs on consciousness, and he was looking into that thing, and he came up with, this theory that the brain and neurons interacted with the electromagnetic field, and he was taken seriously by the guy who it was Paul de Cruyff. He was the name of like a pretty well-known site. It was Microbe Hunters was the name of his book, and so he actually got him on like a speaking tour. And according to Annie Jacobson, and that's in the book Phenomena, that he got involved with the Balokoviches. I'm butchering that, but Joyce Balokovich, through kind of the speaking tour that he did at Princeton and Harvard, and the Balokovich, they're the ones that bring him up to Camden, Maine. And when he's in Camden, Maine, he gets introduced to Alice Astor Bovary, and she's the one that really cuts the check for the Roundtable Foundation, and is the one that, allows for the funding of this. It's a lab. So the Roundtable Foundation is a laboratory where they come and they test psychics and they test other people for, kind of some of these abilities. So when you mentioned the Faraday cage, they would put the famous psychic Eileen Garrett in the Faraday cage, and they would have her kind of read.
Is that her right there?
I believe so. That would make
that's Puharich's silhouette right there on the left for people who are watching this.
And that's what she was. She was a famous psychic, and the whole world of parapsychology back in New York in the 30s and 40s is really interesting. And she was kind of in the center of that. I think reluctantly, from what people have kind of said, she didn't necessarily want to be psychic, but she was better at it, these experiments, than anyone else. And so they would test her, and they would do kind of these things. But to get kind of into like what I found fascinating about the Roundtable Foundation when I started looking into it is, okay, so Alice Astor Bovary, she's the daughter of John Jacob Astor IV, who was at one point maybe the richest man in the United States around the 1890s. When you think of the Gilded Age, the Astors are,
at the top.
Yeah. And that's what he dies in the Titanic, and he leaves this fortune to her. But the thing about John Jacob Astor IV, I know there's a ton of interesting stuff about kind of him in the Titanic. I don't know a lot about it, but I've seen that circulating. But one of the things in his history I found is that he wrote a book about psychic aliens communicating with humans back in
Astor did?
Yes, John Jacob Astor IV in 1896. Let me look up the name of it. It's Journey Between something. A Journey in Other Worlds. And that was no
idea. So this stuff goes way back, this contactee stuff. Wow.
And that's what, I was blown away by that, because it's like, that's like cutting edge science fiction, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not like a science fiction expert, but I do know like the Jules Verne and kind of like the late 19th century, like that is pretty, cutting edge stuff. And it gets into this interest with the occult. And so the occult is where you would see some of these themes of contacting and, psychic aliens, you would see that in those kinds of communities. And so the Astors are super interesting. I also found the original Astor made a lot of his money through the opium trade in like the 18 teens. And so that's also an interesting component of the Astor history, because that's a really interesting component of British banking family history. Like when you start to see, I don't have the names off the top of my head, but there's a lot of people who made a lot of money in the opium trade.
Yale was funded by opium money. The Russell Trust and all that stuff is all drug money. It's unbelievable. It's hard to believe because those are the Eastern kind of elites. So you like, oh, what are these guys doing? Well, a lot of them had like outposts through the British Empire and China, and were traders and seamen and stuff like that. It's really unbelievable, but it really is true.
Yeah, and that's what, like I said, I love the history of drugs and drug trafficking and kind of all of that. And so it was really interesting for me. I was like, oh, okay.
People cannot imagine how big the opium trade was back then. It's just such a significant trade. Like the Chinese, Mao killed everybody who did opium and got rid of them. But it used to be like a social scourge on in China, and there were like rebellions and stuff about the trade. The Boxer Rebellion, I think, was about getting opium into China, into that, into that market.
Yeah, it was, the opium. There were a couple different opium wars, and the British in India, the colony, had just massive, industrial style farms, or more like plantation style farms to get, opium into China, because it was the only currency that was, valuable to many of the Chinese traders. And it was cheap to produce. But yeah, Mao goes and kills everyone, and then also the Taiwanese government picks up some of the opium trade. So that's
Chiang Kai-shek apparently was kind of a naughty boy. He wasn't. He was corrupt.
Yeah. So that's interesting. But
it's an interesting side. But like these families, that's why a lot of them got their money, and then they launder it into kind of like normal trades, landowners or farmers. But some of these guys started like that. A lot of Yale stuff. But yeah, the Astros. Have you ever heard the term the Collins elite?
Yes, I have.
Those people who are around Puharich are the Collins elite. Is that your understanding? All the Astros. Like this Puharich. I have something like a reference to her somewhere, but there were other families around her. I don't even know who they are.
Yeah, so there was the Astors. Another one of the founding members was Marcello DuPont. So there was a DuPont in the round table. There were the other one that's super interesting.
Bronfmans.
I don't know if the Bronfmans were directly. There might have been like some funding links. That would be a really interesting one to look into.
I have one here, like it says in this article. Puharich, Whitmore, and Schlemmer then set up Lab 9 at Puharich's estate in Austining, New York. The Nine's disciples included multimillionaire businessmen, many hiding behind pseudonyms, including members of Canada's richest family, the Bronfmans.
Yeah, so that's Lab 9. So that would be 70s, because Puharich stays like involved in all of these circles, for 20, 30 years. And so that's like kind of towards the end of Lab 9 is like after Yuri has been published, and he's a little bit more disgraced. But so back in Astor and DuPont were there in the 50s. The other person who was right there in the 50s was Arthur Young, and Arthur Young had just come fresh off of World War II, helping to invent the helicopter. But he goes on this like personal spiritual journey, and he's right there with Puharich. Actually a pretty big influence on Puharich and kind of the, some of the spiritual themes that he's pursuing.
And that is the tie between Puharich and Young to the JFK assassination, right?
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So Arthur Young was married to Ruth Forbes Payne Young. So you hear Forbes, you hear Payne, and then obviously you hear the last name Young. So she had been married to A. Payne, who was a very famous Boston family, part of the original Boston Brahmins. She's obviously a part of the Forbes family that was, through direct lineage of the famous, a lot of money with the Forbes. But her, the way that they get connected through JFK is, I forget if it's her.
It's confusing.
Sister or daughter?
Yeah, it's really confusing because of the Payne Young. So Ruth Payne Young, one of her best friends, is the woman who worked for Dulles. Was Dulles' lover, Bancroft. So Dulles to Bancroft to Ruth Forbes Payne, and her son is Michael Payne. Mm-hmm. And Michael Payne married Ruth Payne, who was Michael Payne's actually in the mix a lot. He gets put into the background, but he's actually there on the day of the assassination. They bring him into the police station. But Ruth Payne, the younger, the marriage one to Michael, gets put out in the front. She has an intel tribe. These are all intel old WASP families. And I mean, it's really cool. But Michael Payne is definitely the son of Ruth Pornsface, who's married to Arthur Young, who's involved in all this kind of occult stuff.
And that's what, so they were the ones, the Michael Payne and his wife were the ones that they were friends with Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald. And so they befriended them. And I want to say that Ruth was the one that got him the job, like at the book depository. And there was introduced them into this white Russian community that was in Dallas at the time, that of, you know, some of these, you know, assassination players that, you know, kind of figure more prominently. But they had
Schultz, there's the white Russian, and then there's another creepy CIA agent whose name I can't, but Oswald was surrounded by handlers in Dallas. Like everybody, something about him was really special, because Ruth Payne did this trip. It's in the book by Max Good. I mean, the documentary, where she like drove up and saw her relatives, the Forbes, and then came back down and picked up Marina in New Orleans and drove her to Dallas. And then JFK gets killed in 2 months, you know? I mean, it's just incredible stuff. Like, and the so-called, it's almost like the Kirk assassination, because the rifle like magically appeared, or the case magically appeared in her garage.
Yeah.
And I mean, and then there's just she's just a very curious person. She was a Quaker too. So she's from kind of like this Eastern kind of sect that Lee Harvey Oswald had manuals and stuff. Like she was trying to turn Oswald onto Quakerism. I mean, it's just so much.
That's very interesting.
But it goes back to Puharich, Young, and these other characters and these other blue-blood elites are strangely around. You know, it's just unbelievable stuff.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. They, you know, he like Puharich also at one point he was Henry Wallace. He was like kind of, you know, friendly. I think Henry Wallace, the vice president under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the one who ran for president in 1948 on the progressive ticket, the Progressive Party, who should have been he should have been the president when FDR died. FDR died in 1945 instead of Truman, but he had been pushed out. But he was interested in the Round Table Foundation. It was like he gave some money to them, and that's the guy who's credited with putting, you know, the all-seeing eye on the dollar bill. He was a noted Freemason, very interested in the occult. Actually had his political career ruined by associations with the occult, because he, you know, kind of consulted this Russian mystic guru. So there's fascinating.
There was a documentary about that guy. It was like, I forgot what it was, but what was the name of his guru? Forgot his name. He had some guy, and he was like total like Blavatsky type figure. But I
forget. I just remember that his correspondence with the guru was leaked, and he addressed the letters as "Dear Guru," and you know, it was this Russian mystic, and the, you know, American public couldn't tolerate it. But that's what I mean, fascinating people around Puharich, and those are the people around, you know, kind of the Round Table Foundation, and those are the, you know, the very spooky. But there's naval intelligence swirling around the Round Table Foundation. Actually, the barn that he first converted into the laboratory at the Round Table Foundation used to be a naval munitions storage barn, and so it was like, you know, and this is why I was like, when I said earlier about the interview with Geraldo Rivera, how he mentioned that he was part of a naval intelligence program in 1947. If he was part of a naval intelligence program in 1947, this would have been, you know, before the CIA was officially chartered, and the people primarily responsible for, you know, doing research into these drugs and into these narco-hypnosis would have been the Navy and the Army, and they are. One of the reasons that they're so interested in studying this, we should bring up, is because of Paperclip, and because of the Nazi science programs. And they had been experimenting with mescaline, and they were looking for a way to hack into the mind and control, you know, they were looking at all sorts of stuff. And then we became terrified that the Soviets were going to be able to do this. And we had brainwashing reports coming back from Korea. There was a famous cardinal, Minzensky, who was put out in front of, I think it was either on radio, like they had a confession from this Catholic cardinal that the Soviets put out, and it was very clearly like it looked like he had been, brainwashed. And so there was, all this climate. And so the reason that I bring some of that up is because if he was involved in 1947 in an intelligence agency's efforts to study stuff like narco hypnosis and, try to create Manchurian assassins and Manchurian candidates, then that means that all of his work would have been kind of under the auspices of such a program, of such an intelligence agency, because he gets credited with becoming officially part of the CIA and the Army in 1953. But if he was involved in a program in 1947, that colors the Roundtable Foundation completely differently, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's interesting because the CIA didn't kind of get its boogeyman status until the 70s because people didn't know what they were up to in the 60s and 70s. But yeah, it's I think it's Morse Allen is the guy who's the connection between Puharich and Wasson pre-CIA, pre-53. And so all those guys, and even the military intelligence, I mean, they just didn't have all that stuff. It was the OSS and all that. So the people who, the blue-blooded surnames that supported the Balakoviches is Forbes, Cabo, and DuPont. And the like you said, the Czech that got it off the map was Alice Astor Bouverie, whose New York residence Puharich would eventually meet Huxley. So I've got some interesting things about like his connection to Huxley, who's also psychonaut, right? I mean, this guy has to be seen as a psychonaut too, or what? Now, maybe is that the right word, or is it what's the drug not like where you're like drug taker? Maybe that's what the correct.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I've heard psychonaut as like the exploration into the mind.
Yeah, I think that's fair. He has a memoir. I haven't read it, but Memories of a Maverick. Yeah, he's a Maverick.
Yeah,
so like Wasson has the book on this. He also had one too. So here he is, like religifying the mushroom, the sacred. It's sacred and it's key to the door of eternity. So it's key to eternity. This is the pre-LSD kind of whitewashing of drug use as a spiritual enhancer, right? So I think that I would say this is kind of sinister. I don't know when he published this, but.
Oh, I mean, he is a sinister. I mean, you have to, like, there's some things that are a little bit like you just have to look at kind of what he was doing and laugh. There's that element to him, but he was I mean, when you're working for the CIA and you're working in mind control and those kinds of experiments, and when you dig into like, the stuff that they were doing, he's a very sinister figure. And kind of the ways. I mean, I'm reading Peter Levinda's Sinister Forces, book 1. It's titled The Nine, because he's got some information on Puharich in there, and what he likens it to is, a pursuit of black magic. And Levinda's a really interesting guy. But
wait till you get my slides. He literally equates what he's doing with the Key of Solomon. So yeah, he's saying, I mean, that's the whole thing is like we have this modern terminology for this stuff. But these guys are kind of engaged in kind of medieval magic. It's just the modern iteration of it.
Yeah, that's kind of what's been really preoccupying me recently, these last couple months, is that, I mean, because I'm pretty new to like a lot of this different kind of research and stuff. So it takes a while to kind of piece through, okay, what's really going on? Who can I trust? Blah, 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 blah. But that realization that I kind of had in various people like Levinda or other authors or researchers kind of push you towards that, but it's that idea that exactly like psychological warfare is just another name for magic, and the tactics that psychological warfare agents are using are the tactics that sorcerers and magicians would use. So hypnosis, the use of drugs to, induce fear or try looking for a truth serum. And so that was really big because you grow up with this like Disneyfied version of magic. But then when you actually kind of get into it and you're looking into these tactics of, manipulation of the mind, it's a really interesting angle. yeah, I mean, I would completely agree that it's kind of this black magic that they're attempting
look
to.
at these slides. They'll blow you away. This is Toxic Tiramisu. He was talking about what you said, the weaponizing psychic spies. Funded by the Bronfman family, took it further. He trained 6 psychically gifted space kids to remotely view the Pentagon and Kremlin. This goes back to their interest. They're interested in wealthy women and smart kids. They've always been that way from the very beginning. Is this weird, like trying to find gifted children they can manipulate? It's so strange.
Mhm.
There's all kinds of torture stuff. This is the Lab 9 in Ossining, New York, which is kind of outside of NYC. I think it's a suburb.
It is, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Tell me about this, because I have not heard that the Collins Elite was the group of people that were kind of surrounding him. I'm really interested in the Collins Elite because it is kind of one of these topics that is difficult to hold on to. A lot of times it kind of slips away.
There's not a lot of research. The place that you have to go, my understanding, is Nick Redfern's book, Final Events, Demonic UFOs, Alien Abductions, the Government, and the Afterlife. I tried to get him on my show to talk about it, but it didn't happen. But I think that it was something to do with this elite, but they saw UFOs. This is my understanding. Maybe somebody in the chat knows better, but they saw the UFOs as a malign influence, not as like some kind of helper of humanity or something like that.
Yeah, I heard that it's like it gets caught up with kind of the evangelical Christian kind of wing within the government, and that the government started shutting down programs as a result of the Collins Elite basically saying that, the communication with these entities and that, UFOs and kind of that things were demons. That was kind of my surface level understanding.
I think that's kind of it. That's mine too. Here's like a description. I had some article I saw today. Collins Elite, a group of high-ranking persons with CIA and similar connections, led by Andrija Puharich, began a series of seance-type workings immediately after the death of Jack Parsons on June 17th, 1952. During a long Saturn-Neptune conjunction, they contacted the Nine, a group of beings claiming that's right. So the Ennead, or Egyptian beings that Puharich met with, this is around the time of the first wave of alien contactees. So it coincides supposedly with UFO lore.
So this, okay. And then that's really interesting because Puharich goes down to Mexico and he is looking for psilocybin. And this would have been I think 1956, somewhere around there. And Lavinda thinks that Arthur Young is funding it. Other people think that it's being funded by the CIA. Other people think that he may have just gone down there. But this is kind of after his official time at the CIA. He gets relieved of military duty. So he was working for the Army, but the Army was working together with the CIA on a joint program. So that's kind of how he gets discharged from the Army. And he's going and looking for psilocybin. But while he's in the backwater of Mexico, he runs into this couple called the Logheads from Whipple, Arizona. And the Logheads tell him that they have been channeling the Nine. And he is like, whoa, I can't believe that. I need proof of this or whatever. And so they send him letters later of sealed communications from the Nine, and, are saying that the Nine is being channeled and this is what the Nine said. And they give him the letters, and he is supposed to, he believes in it. Now, some people say that it was Dr. Vinod was the man who channeled the original Nine for the Round Table Foundation. So some people think that Dr. Vinod was down in Arizona channeling the Nine for the Logheads and sent them to Mexico to find Puharich or something like that. But the other theory that I found, I think, more credible was that it was, I think, George Hunt Williamson was the one who was channeling for the Logheads. And that ties directly into Adamski and who was the leader of was it the Silver Shirts?
I know who you're talking about.
William Dudley Pelley.
Yeah, that's right.
William Dudley. And so Hunt Williamson, and I think that Hunt Williamson may have been one of these contactees, but he was connected in with Adamski and that whole network in, I believe it was California. And that adds another interesting, dimension to it as well, because there's this connection between the contactee movement, happening on the other coast, and this contactee, experience happening in Maine, or, quote unquote.
It's just incredible. It's all networked. It's all coming up at the same time. It's like bubbling to the surface, and there's weird connections. This is this guy, Dr. D.G. Vinod, who's supposed to be a Hindu scholar and sage. This is like Puharich's thing. So it's almost kind of like Blavatsky, where they're bringing the East-West. So you kind of see that movement with like Blavatsky and a lot of the, I'm trying to remember what else his name is. Jiddu Krishnamurti. So it's almost like these guys are there. Like, he was apparently the first person, Andrija Puharich, was channeled contact with the Nine. Is this guy?
Yeah. So they met at a party, at a party for Eileen Garrett in New York, and he's supposed to have grabbed Puharich by the ring finger and recited his past to him as if he was reading out of a book, like, with such detail and clarity that it had to have been clairvoyance. And then he tells him about his future, and so Puharich is like, oh, I got to get you out to the Round Table Foundation. And the story is supposedly they bring him on New Year's Eve of 1952, December 31st, 1952, I think, and he kind of falls into this trance state immediately upon entering the Round Table Foundation's mansion. And Puharich channels the Nine through him. They give him a message, and then he has like a series of seances. So they bring Vinod back a few months later, and that's kind of like the one. They have the Monkey King is the Hindu iconography that they have in the room with them, and pieces of string appear out of nowhere. There's 9 pieces of string, and they're given to each member of the Nine, and it's the Nine is telling them that they are going to be a new era of Brahmins, so that they were going to be kind of atop of this spiritual caste system, and that their job is to go kind of evangelize the world, and to bring peace, and that there's like this threat of there's this threat of annihilation, but the Nine are here to help them like save the world, and they're going to become enlightened and ascended masters and all of this kind of stuff.
Here's the story of Vinod. This is it. On June 27th, 1953, 9 people met with Dr. Vinod at the Round Table Foundation in Maine. They were Henry Jackson, Georgia Jackson, Alice Bouverie, who we already mentioned, Marcella DuPont, Carl Betts, Vonnie Beck, Arthur Young, and Ruth Payne Young, and I. So they were all there. Like, this is incredible stuff. So her son is right there in the JFK assassination, and she's on this thing in like almost a decade before. She's channeling the 9, gods or whatever.
I mean,
it's all there. There's the Hindu god Hanuman, the monkey god, right? Or Hanum.
Yeah, the Monkey King. That's right. He's
trance state at 12:15 a.m. He spoke for about 15 minutes. Then one of the 9 spoke through him, saying, "Tonight we want to create Brahmins in this world. Brahmin means a person dedicated to Brahman." And that's what these guys are referenced to. So he's probably just selling, what they want to hear, because they're mentioned as Eastern Brahmins, right? Like high caste wasps.
Yeah.
Anyway, there it is. Crazy.
I know, and that's what I mean. It's
sacred threads they wore, yeah.
And that's that's
it's all kind of occultism. It's all this channeling stuff. It gets in. There's the Brotherhood. There's the mystery schools. Like, it's all there. So this, like, once you get past the surface and get down into this is like all space brothers, space beings. It's basically like freaking Blavatsky or something.
Well, that's what I mean. These, like, kind of what I mentioned with, Astor, the John Jacob Astor IV, of kind of being in this, and there's an interesting, like, there are 2 wings of the Astor family. So there isn't like an Anglican wing of the Astor family as well. And the Astor family are the ones who had Stephen Ward on their property. Like, he was living in a cottage, and Ward is the reason for the Profumo affair, with its, Christine Keeler was, sleeping with Russian, or Soviet GRU, and or was it? It was different at that point. But
I think she was sleeping with everybody, but the one
yeah,
she was also was Profumo and some kind of KGB asset, is my understanding.
Yeah, it was KGB, and that was
But
what.
Ward was at the center. He was kind of like an elite pimp, also a black magician, and a pretty interesting guy. And they probably killed him. I did a show with Douglas about him. For people who don't know, a lot of people miss that story. But the thing is that you talked about the Gilded Age. A lot of people don't know is that when a lot of these elites kind of made it in the WASPs made it in the US, they wanted to go back to the UK. The ties were so close that they wanted to take their kind of aristocratic heritage and go back to the UK. And the Astors were part of that. So they always had this kind of Atlanticist tie from these elites. They were, that's who they compared themselves to. And so the Astors were definitely part of that stuff.
And that's what I mentioned him one time earlier, and I've read a bunch of his work. He has a bunch of work on Puharich, but recluse Stephen Snyder, and he has a book that is it's like Trump, Epstein, and the Anglo-American. Like
I interviewed him about that. People can see it in my archives. Yeah.
That is, I'll have to definitely check that out. And he goes into that Anglo-American network in the late 19th century, leading into the early 20th century, and kind of lays it out, bare. And he talks a lot about the Astors as well in that. And so that's interesting. But that, like what you mentioned with like Stephen Ward being a black magician, I mean, they were like all into the occult, both sides of the family. And Bouverie, like Alice Bouverie, fits right into that. And all these people who are part of the Round Table Foundation, I'm sure were interested in, that kind of Helena Blavatsky, theosophy. I know that Henry
root
Wallace
races, Brahmin is kind of like a root race, kind of an Indian type thing, Aryan and Brahmin and all this stuff. So it would make sense to a lot of these people, if they're not Christian, like to adopt this kind of view. This is a great long article by Stephen Snyder. Advice up. I'll put a link to this. It's called "The Office of Security Meet the Nine, Even Stranger Things." It's really good.
Yeah, that's what he's got a couple on Vice Up about about that, about Puharich and Project Artichoke, different stuff like that. Yeah, and so that element of like the occult aspect, because it also feeds into the New Age movement, and so Arthur Young becomes a huge figure in the New Age movement. And he's kind of like, you can see this lineage between kind of theosophy and it merging into kind of this hallucinogenic counterculture spirituality that emerges late 50s, early 60s.
Rexford Daniels, Puharich's alleged penguin handler, so he has all this stuff about penguin here. According to, let's see, this great Philip Coppins provides us in-depth detail about super soldiers. According to Puharich himself, it was around this time he was spotted by the intelligence agencies as a potential asset. Puharich claimed he became involved with Project Penguin, a project whose existence has been denied by its sponsor. Project Penguin allegedly got underway in 1948, a Navy exercise that ran for some years. Its scope, to test individuals set to possess psychic powers. In the charge of the project was Rexford Daniels, according to a statement made by Puharich on the Geraldo, which you mentioned, Geraldo Rivera show on October 2nd, 1987. Rexford Daniels did indeed exist and owned a company in the 70s that must have attracted the attention of Puharich as the company did research into an area which Puharich was a world-renowned expert at the time, how proliferating electromagnetic emissions interfere with one another and may work harmful environmental effects on man. They were doing that. Like it's all there. Like after Dulles, it was Helms, and he was totally involved in all those things. The secret manipulation of minds through electromagnetism. It's crazy stuff.
Yeah, and that's what there's also, and then it begins to make you like question some of these other like later contactee movements. It's like, is that what's kind of happening? Like, are these discarnate voices being beamed into people's skulls through kind of different forms of like technology like this? Because they definitely figured it out and they were definitely doing stuff like that. So how much of like this kind of UFO,
how many of these people are MK Ultra subjects? That's the question we have to ask now. Is how many people are really subjects? They're not contactees. They're contactees because somebody like Puharich made them contactees.
And that whole the what I mentioned earlier with like kind of this connection to cybernetics and these people at the Macy Foundation looking into the mind technology interface. So I mean, you're talking about like, and what kind of doesn't show up necessarily in the 60s and 70s, but what you see kind of emerge later with social media and different stuff like that. It just makes you think of like, how have these programs evolved, and how have they been in, they figure some of these things out in the 50s and 60s, but then there are decades after that of application. And so, I think that's a really interesting question to consider, is like, how have they adapted it to, throughout.
Operational application from
Yeah.
experimental. I did a whole show on that. Hypnosis from experimental to operational application of this stuff. Like, that's the whole thing. These are all meant to be operationalized, guys. We're at the 55-minute mark. Do you have time to go through some comments? I have a lot of comments.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see where we're at. Let's do this. Greetings from NYC. Hey, Michael. Uncle Ted, welcome. Niagara College. Why would somebody look into Niagara College? I don't know. Lavenda strikes again. Hey, Tolkien, welcome back. I haven't seen you in a while. Andrija Puharich. Yeah, he wrote like 5 books, guys. You want to hear Uri Geller's music? Hear some strange stuff. Yeah, he's still around. I think he's been totally discredited. That's the whole thing, is like, Geller went on to Johnny Carson, and Carson gave him a bunch of spoons and stuff and said, recreate your findings. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it live because the spoon bending is like a magic trick. You like have this fake spoon and stuff. Puharich made some shrooms and said that an Egyptian spirit taught him a ritual while using interesting near Kenny Buckport. Yeah. Puharich said East is Michael Angel. It's really strong, and people are either very good morally or very bad, and it doesn't work well if you're in between. I guess ESP uses a lot of emotional energy work. I wouldn't know. Camden is one of the nicest towns in Maine. Tolkien, my mother loved this guy, totally conned by him. Interesting. Good evening, Intellects D'Artagnan. Hey, guys. Let's see, Uncle Ted. McVeigh had 38 dentist appointments. That's kind of scary when you consider what Puharich was up to. He's like a mad scientist. He's like Sidney Gottlieb. Apparently, Lucille Ball heard radio waves. Yeah, some of these people may be tampered with. I don't know. People are hearing voices. Absolutely, they are. Well, good point, William. I think the 9 is a fake channeled material. It might be, but it sounds like other channeled material. And you have to look at it in the context of some of these other MK Ultra religion. They were trying to create religions, and I know that A Course in Miracles is fake. It is another one of the MK Ultra sub projects. There's just absolutely no doubt about it. It's a sub project, and so much like Gordon Wasson, this promotion of the mushroom, which I just showed his book. Like the religification of it, or whatever, the sacralization of a thing. Like, it didn't have that before. It maybe had it in like whatever the shamanistic practices, but to Western minds, it's like this is the replacement of Christianity or something like that.
That was, yeah. I mean, that's still. I mean, the immortality key. There's a long tradition of those kind of hallucinogenic studies and the spiritual, like the viewing them kind of through that lens is like the sacramental nature.
Right. Hemisync and holosync, like Stanislav Grof. It's all the King Arthur imagery and symbolism again. Puharich was completely engrossed in theosophy. That makes perfect sense. Astor funded John Keeley. I don't know much about him, but yeah, I'll have to look in that. Doug Valentine's for CIA drug smuggling details. Yeah, that and the famous book. Whose author I can't remember, but it's basically the Golden Triangle or whatever. Yeah, Golden Triangle. More helicopters. Her daughter at Oswald. Yeah, the Paynes are all over the Oswald story, guys, in a big bad way. It's Michael Payne to his mom, who I just said was sitting down with this guy Vinod, and channeling the 9, like. Yeah, Uncle Ted, Jack Ruby rented a room. I thought it was the other way around. I thought that John David Norman rented from Ruby. And Norman's the guy, I think it was the Genesis kid, teen boy lover, whatever thing. Hey, Jesus, God bless you. God bless you too. Roerich. Yeah, Nicholas Roerich. You got to read the Stargate Conspiracy by Lynn Pickett for the Henry Wallace Puharich connection. Yeah, I will.
Yeah, that is. I think that's next on the list.
Author of Simon Necronomicon, Lavenda. Yeah, he does. I actually was watching him do a lecture about the Nine today. He hates my guts. He tried to get me labeled as an anti-Semite. I have to go find those other things. They really they hate my guts so much because I'm such a Crowley critic, but Lavenda hates me.
Yeah, that's.
Unquenchable fire.
That's super interesting. Super interesting to look at some of his biography. You probably know much more than I do, but
one of the giveaways is that he was on an occult documentary conducting a Crowley ritual. So,
yeah, was it the OTO?
Yeah, OTO. Yeah, I mean, he worked at the Magical Child. It's like epicenter for all occult stuff in New York City.
Yeah, that author of the Necronomicon, and then he was working in the Orthodox churches in New York during Vietnam to get a military deferment, and the wandering bishops and all that. It's super weird.
I think he dressed up as a wandering bishop at one point. He was one of these wandering bishops, like David Ferry, and William Joseph Bryan. I think he went to RFK's funeral as a wandering bishop in '68 or something crazy like that.
Yeah, he talks about some of that, but then obviously not all of it. So some of the stories I've heard around that are bonkers.
Yeah, Donna Marie Farrell, appreciate all you do, both of you. New subscriber, keep trucking. Thank you. Go to Substack, Hemispheric Press, check it out. And the podcast again is Bad Press Podcast. Yeah, we got about 160 live listeners. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Men Who Stare at Goats. Yeah, this all overlaps. Puharich is really an important figure. I mean, we could probably just do a whole story on just one aspect of his crazy life. Facebook life log. Yeah, I think that's pretty well established. Tolkien. Absolutely, William. Awesome show. Glad to see you. Good to see you as well. It's been a while. A lot of these people come back. I haven't seen in a while. Any thoughts on Discordian? I have a lot of thoughts on Discordianism. I know a lot about Discordianism, but I don't know if Puharich is part of it. But hey, great stream. Peace. Thanks, Uncle Ted. Excellent word. Truly appreciate. Thanks, Don Marie. I don't know. I mean, but I do have all these pictures of him. There's Phenomena. That's the book that you mentioned earlier. So they're covered Puharich, a lot of that guy in there. But this is an intro. These are the guys that he's affiliated with: Puthoff, Tar, Kit Green, Pat Price. This is them from their 60s, 70s regatta. Look at the clothes. Incredible.
I know.
I think Puthoff is still around. There's Morse Allen.
Yeah, he just did a Rogan a couple months ago.
Right? Didn't he? Is that
right?
Yeah. Wow. Puharich is featured in a Perry Mason episode called "The Case of the Meddling Medium."
Yeah, he plays the same kind of character as he was in kind of.
He plays himself, right?
Yeah,
if anybody gets a copy of that, send it to me. I couldn't do it. Anyway, I'll read this out. This is from Huxley, who visited Puharich. So he wrote somebody, quote, "I spent some days earlier this month at Glen Cove in the strange household assembled by Puharich. Alice Bouverie and Miss P behaving to one another in a conspicuously friendly way. Eleanor Bond doing telepathic guessing remarkably well, but not producing anything of interest or value in the mediumistic sitting she gave me. Frances Farrelly with her diagnostic machine." So there's these machines again. The psychogalvanometer that Estabrooks had, or Hubbard's OT, or whatever system he had. So these guys all had these devices. Let me finish this. Which Puharich tests have been shown to be merely an instrument, like a crystal ball for concentrating ESP faculties. Harry, the Dutch sculptor, who goes into trances in the Faraday cages and produces automatic scripts in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Narodny, the cockroach man, who was preparing experiments to test the effects of human telepathy on insects. It was all very lively and amusing, and I really think promising. For whatever may be said against Puharich, he is certainly very intelligent, extremely well-read, and highly enterprising. His aim is to reproduce by modern pharmacological, electronic, and physical methods the conditions used by the shamans for getting into a state of traveling clairvoyance, and then, if he succeeds, to send people to explore systematically the other world. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Huxley, I mean, that's what I mean. It's like he was right at the beginning of all of, you can find connections between him and then a lot of these, kind of fathers of the, psychedelic movement that spring up.
No, it's an incredible statement though, but he's like the likelihood of the shamanism and all that stuff and the overlap between Huxley and Crowley, who he knew Crowley. Like Crowley turned, like people set that date of magic mushrooms being popularized. Crowley was giving out kind of medically created anhelomium, what he called anhelomium, which is like, or anhelonium, which was some kind of like psilocybin derivative in the 10s and 20s around World War One. So he turned Huxley on to some kind of mushroom in the early 30s, is my understanding.
That's
Crowley
very
did.
interesting.
Yes. Here is on the very far left. That's Puharich. That's Jacques Vallée. That's John Keel. I mean, these are just like bigwigs. Vallée is all over the place, the occult and all kinds of stuff, and spacecraft and things like that. So Puharich is in the mix.
Yeah, that there's Uri Geller. So I mean, that's one we can talk, just a little bit more about. I mean, Uri Geller was, I think that he was perhaps like maybe famous before, Puharich went over there, but Puharich was tasked with, going over, and I think that he was working for the, kind of working for the CIA when he went over to Israel to kind of investigate Geller. But Geller had also been tied up with the Mossad, and so that was a really interesting kind of intelligence, connection that was happening there. But Puharich brings Uri Geller over to the United States, kind of introduces him to a lot of people. I think in Phenomena, Annie Jacobson says that they met with Werner von Braun for some reason.
Wow.
So that was just like, it was just one sentence in Phenomena, but when it like that is something like, I know I mentioned it earlier, kind of this connection to Paperclip, but Puharich was working at Edgewood Arsenal with Paperclip scientists. So I mean, there are confirmed Nazi scientists that came and were a part of that MK Project Artichoke, kind of MK Ultra team at Edgewood Arsenal. And so I think that the fact that he also then meets in the early 70s, like probably when Werner von Braun is towards, kind of towards the end of his, I don't know if he's towards the end of his life, but, the NASA has kind of already run its course. But I found that super fascinating. But he also brings Uri Geller over to Stanford Research Institute, and that's where, you see Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, and Kit Green is the guy from the CIA who is handling what he called the weird desk. But he is over there. And then, it showed, that picture showed Pat Price. And they were studying Uri Geller, and they also studied him down at, I want to say, what is the big laboratory down in Southern California? Is it Livermore, Lawrence Livermore?
I think that sounds correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't Los Alamos, it wasn't Sandia, so it must have been Lawrence Livermore. And they studied him at Lawrence Livermore. Now the, kind of the mythology around it has that the scientists at Livermore experienced like some very weird things with Geller. And Geller got discredited, but one of the people that discredited him was like a stage magician, James Randi. And James Randi is another one of these, you look at James Randi, and I think that he has CIA connections, and he has some weird. The CIA has a long-standing relationship with stage magicians, as you would be interested in kind of sleight of hand as a spy. And so Mulholland was another guy earlier in the story that the CIA, he was more affiliated with the Gottlieb wing. So Gottlieb, and that was the technical services staff. And this is, not to kind of beat a dead horse with Recluse, but he really makes the differentiation between the Office of Security and the technical services staff. And so there was this kind of ideological split within the CIA that the Puharich was part of Artichoke, and that was Morse Allen. Morse Allen was kind of overseeing Artichoke, and then Gottlieb was overseeing the technical services staff, and they were overseeing MK Ultra. So there were two programs that were running parallel to each other that would cross over, but they had kind of some different philosophies about how to do the research and kind of what the psychological approach to the research would be. And so Gottlieb and Mulholland were not as into the occult nature of like, I think the way that Ewan Cameron is described, like, because that was, he was kind of their guy, is he was a behaviorist. And so he believed in kind of like this mechanistic explanation of consciousness that, consciousness, like it wasn't very spiritual. At least like that's my understanding, is that he believed
robots
that,
and mechanical animals or whatever it is. Yeah.
And that you could kind of hack into the system like that. And Cameron was at one point, I believe, the president of the American
World Psychiatric Foundation or something
first,
the world. Crazy.
Yeah. And so they had MK Ultra and the technical services staff wanted to run their experiments through institutions so that there was another barrier of protection. Whereas Artichoke, they were running experiments on soldiers, and they were running experiments in prisons, and they were doing things a little bit. MK Ultra would also kind of go on to do the same things, but it seems like Project Artichoke was a little bit more kind of rogue and esoteric. And so, anyways, Mulholland hated Puharich. He thought he was a trickster. He thought he was devious, and so they had a couple of interactions. And the other person that Puharich almost got into a fight with was Frank Olson, the guy who.
Oh, wow! So there's a connection between them. I didn't know that.
They both worked at Fort Detrick
right
at the same time, because he was part of the Chemical and Biological Warfare Division, and that was the chemical and biological warfare was what the Army was classifying their research into drugs as. And so there's a really interesting. This story is crazy to me. It was part of Project Artichoke, and it was have you ever heard of the Pont Saint-Esprit incident?
No, tell me about it.
So there was this collective madness that seized this small village in France in the early 50s. And it was people were jumping out of windows. There were people who thought that there were snakes in their stomach. There were people that thought that they were being chased by lions. It was this mass hysteria that broke out. And the cause of it was attributed to ergot poisoning, and ergot mold in the bread. And so that it had gotten into the grain supply, that it had been a particularly rainy summer, and that the harvest had molded, and that had developed St. Anthony's fire, and that it got into the food system. So that was the mainstream explanation. But there, I think, what is his name? H.B. Albarelli.
A Terrible Mistake. That's the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I've read some of that. It's a tome, so I haven't gotten through all of it, but he has kind of a CIA contact that he tells him that actually that was an artichoke experiment where they used aerosol LSD, and they put LSD into the food supply to test kind of what would happen. And it went horribly wrong. I don't think they necessarily anticipated that, because people died. There was 6 or 7 people that died from this, from, kind of accidental death. And so they had to keep that on the hush. But Frank Olson was also, so there's one of the theories is that maybe Frank Olson, knew too much about that. And when he begins to kind of have his psychological break and kind of his, it seems like he's struggling with kind of his moral compass, working for the Chemical and Biological Warfare Division, that, they can't have him talking about things like the Pont Saint-Esprit incident. But he was also over in Europe. He was not just LSD. He was overseeing the rest of the chemical and biological warfare agents and their testing, and they were testing them on, Nazi and Soviet prisoners over in, over in Europe, and also I'm sure, in the United States. But he was witness to a lot of those experiments. And like I said, he kind of has this psychological break, and then he ends up at a CIA retreat in, I want to say it was, I forget exactly, I think it was in Maryland. Just, kind of a some miles out of Fort Detrick, but he gets dosed with LSD in his Cointreau, and then he really breaks. And Mulholland is one of the guys they go send him to see if he can figure out how to fix him. And then Frank Olson obviously ends up dead. I guess it's still technically ruled as suicide, but his son, Frank Olson's son, sued the CIA and won damages for that whole incident.
They exhumed his body, and they said he had injuries before hitting the ground. So, I mean, these are textbook ways to kill somebody. You throw them out of a window, much like they did the other guy from the Defense Department. What was his name? They drove him insane, kind of like Olson, and then they chuck you out of a window. His name was it was the 50s, right around Olson too. But they ruled it as suicide, you know. But that's how you discredit him first, is you drive him crazy, and then you have then your motive is right there. Oh, he was crazy. He jumped out of a window. Somebody in the chat has got to know this guy's name. By the way, Bart, Gottlieb wasn't the one. It was Murray. The guy's name was Murray. Another kind of spooked up doctor. And the book we mentioned was A Terrible Mistake by Hank Albarelli. And that title is referencing that Frank Olson said, "I think I've made a terrible mistake." So that's how he got the title of the book. Is like he was bummed out about being involved in all this stuff. Actually, Forrestal, thank you, Bart. The guy. So Forrestal, I don't know when he died, but very close to Olson, if I remember correctly. Same way, supposedly jumped out of a building.
Yeah. Very interesting. But yeah, and so you see, there's that Olson Puharich connection at
49.
Fort Detrick. And then, he was talking about all the way back in Fort Detrick, he was talking about the weaponization of ESP and the weaponization of remote viewing. And so it makes sense that he shows back up with the kind of official psychic spy program of the CIA, and he shows up with Pat Price and some of those other spies who were being trained to remote view in the 70s that would turn into Operation Stargate. It's
crazy. This guy was hypnotizing everybody like a freaking CIA doctor. I don't know which book this is from, but it's Space Kids, Puharich. Ostensibly, this was to investigate their extent of their power, such as metal bending, but significantly, Puharich soon had them remote viewing and hypnotize them to tell him where their powers originated. So, he's hypnotizing the kids too.
Another interesting thing about that Lab 9, because that was, kind of mid to late 70s, he was doing that, is the guy that was working with him and also helped publish his book, Yuri, was Ira Einhorn, the unicorn killer. And so he was also caught up with Einhorn. So, it's in the Bronfman connection that you mentioned, I do remember coming across that. That opens up a whole other, can of worms.
They're Nexium, all kinds of stuff. They like these freaking wacko new age people. They support them. And they supported Einhorn. Do you know who paid to get Einhorn to France?
No,
one of the Bronfman girls.
But that's just bananas.
Yeah,
because
totally
and that's
crazy.
Bronfman started the mega group with Les Wexner.
So it's just they're supporting just the worst people, and they made their money not on drugs but alcohol, like Seagram 7 or whatever.
They were bootleggers.
Yeah.
But they married into. I think that the Bronfmans married into the Rothschilds. He went from being they were all connected into the mafia. That was the original connection to the Jewish mafia and the bootlegging that was happening across the Canadian border into, I think it was New York. But yeah, that's one that I haven't explored as much, but that's crazy.
Ira Einhorn, who led seminars at Esalen, stated that his mentor, Puharich, was doing LSD work for the CIA in 1954. He linked Puharich with Sidney Gottlieb and MK Ultra and related that Puharich was involved in experiments that resulted in the death of Frank Olson.
Yeah, because it was him, because Frank Olson, it was very against kind of, I think, this idea of ESP and the occult. And so that was what they had originally kind of gotten into an argument about when he was talking about, kind of the weaponization of ESP. Because I think Frankel. So there were, a few people who, like, because the CIA was doing all this stuff, but there were still, some hardline, conservative Christian military men who were like, this is absolutely insane.
Get this. So this is the whole thing. This is the overlap element of what Puharich was doing in Esalen, which we can do a whole nother show on Esalen because there's so many important things to come out of here. But here it is. Another 9 channeler was an English woman named Jenny O'Connor, who was introduced to the Esalen Institute by Sir John Whitmore. She and the 9 became so influential there that they held seminars and were, strangely enough, listed on the Institute staff, even successfully ordering the sacking of its chief financial officer and the reorganization of its entire management structure.
So, and the fact that you bring up Esalen is also really interesting because we mentioned the connection to Roddenberry, and Puharich got a hold of Roddenberry through, I think it was like a former British race car driver, like Sir John Whitmore, I think is his name. But anyways, he got a hold of Roddenberry.
I just mentioned him.
Yeah, and he got a hold of Roddenberry, and then Roddenberry actually wrote scripts that included the 9 of Puharich in the in the actual like mythos of Star Trek. And Christopher Knowles, who runs the Secret Sun blog, and he also, I don't know if he has a podcast, but
I've had him on twice. He does a lot of work on Patreon. I don't know if he has a podcast, but he's been around for decades.
Yeah, and I read a lot of his blog and follow his Substack and stuff, but he has like I don't know, it's got like 20 articles on the secret Star Trek, and kind of he leads that series with an investigation into Esalen, and he shows, and I forget, I'm not a Trekkie, I don't know a lot about Star Trek, but there's one of the movies that opens and he's like, it's at Esalen. Like it was either filmed at Esalen or it was like the set was built to resemble Esalen, and the themes were, thematically it was, a lot of the same, kind of stuff that Esalen was preaching at the time. And that 9 connection, it's the same 9, and Arthur Young is involved in all of those projects out in, California, and in that movement. I think that he started like the Institute for Noetic Sciences. I want to say that he was involved with Edgar Mitchell. So I'm not as up to date.
He's the moon landing. Yeah, I've had the guy who was the head of the IONS on my show. I forgot his name right now, but they're involved in the same stuff Puharich was. That's a West Coast thing, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. It's like it's the same. You see these references to the 9 at the Esalen, like it's the same thing. It's the same.
It's the same thing, right?
Exactly. And it started with, well, it didn't start with the Roundtable Foundation. So actually, what Christopher Knowles in that series, he kind of uncovers this article that was published by Ray Palmer. So the guy who published like Fate and Fantastic Stories or Fantastic Adventures, like the big magazines where all of these kind of UFO stories were being published in the late 40s. And in that article, this stuff, it was written by this lady who she is called Son of the Sun, and she lays out the 9 that is basically a blueprint for what is picked up by Puharich. So it's like these 9 alien intelligences that are here to help humanity and like steer humanity like through. And it's like a 7-page article, but I found that super interesting that it's like the occult community in California that's publishing these stories is what gets picked up by the Roundtable Foundation.
The guy who was the head of the Noetic Order is Dean Radin. Real Magic, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Science, and a Guide to the Secret Powers of the Universe. He was the former head of the Noetic. IONS, yeah. Crazy.
Yeah. And that's what, like I said, I want to say that like Arthur Young was involved in the creation of that. I might be getting it confused with another one of those.
It wouldn't surprise me, but this is so amazing. Like the connections are off the charts. I didn't know Puharich was connected to Olson. Now I have to read A Terrible Mistake. Albarelli's also done like books on those strange stuff around JFK.
Yeah, coup and Dallas.
Passed away. Yeah, he's passed away.
Yeah, I have that book and it's sitting in my to read pile, but apparently A Coup in Dallas is, top notch as far as JFK assassination research goes.
It's just there's a lot of people who say that Puharich is no good, and I'll read one of their. Oh, this is the one on one of his appendices where he literally wrote, "The earliest recorded reference that I can find on this subject is alleged to be the authorship of Solomon the King. The Key of Solomon is a classic of the techniques to be used in psychic operations, or magic, as it was called." So he's basically uh, saying that magic and psychic operations are the same. He's practicing magic. It's
Yeah.
basically an admission right here.
Yeah.
And he's talking about operations. That's what Crowley said, operations. It's weird how it plays off into Intel too. But this kind of operation. I'm going to read this. This is from Brentstone. This is his opinion of Puharich. In my opinion, Andrija Puharich was a major scumbag and arguably did more to F up the future of human society than any other single person in the last 100 years. Puharich was put through medical school on the Army's dime and was immediately put into the service of the military-industrial complex as a key researcher into new and exciting ways to strip humanity of its free will. Not only did Puharich invent and patent voice-to-skull and artificial telepathy technology, people have referred to him as the father of the new age, due to his role in pushing many of the memes and tropes which make up spiritual and metaphysical thought today. He was the man who introduced psilocybin mushrooms to the modern world and made treks off into the remote mountains of Mexico to bring back hallucinogenic and entheogenic plants, which were studied by the Army and the CIA as methods for controlling the human mind. He was the mentor of Bob Monroe. I don't know. He was the man who hypnotized Carla Ruckert and programmed her to channel Ra of the Law of One. See, that's just so. This is another connection we didn't even cover. He was the man who worked with the Mossad to push Uri Geller as a celebrity and dumb down the whole topic of ESP research to the public. He was the man who brought trafficked children from all over the world to his facility in Ossining, New York, where he programmed them to believe they were star kids on a mission to save Earth from some nebulous ecological disaster. There's the disaster theme. His new age stuff. There's always some cataclysm or disaster on the horizon. He was the man who ran around studying Tesla technology with a femme fatale who was secretly an agent of the National Reconnaissance Office who claimed to channel space beings. I wish I was making any of this up, but this man's story is more insane than I could ever convey here. No one realized the hidden hand behind his machinations was the CIA and their MK Ultra project, Army and Navy intelligence, and the Tavistock Institute, who used his work to create the new technologies of the psycho-civilized society written about by British Fabian H.G. Wells in his book Open Conspiracy and the Shape of Things to Come. When Klaus Schwab says you will own nothing and be happy, you can thank people like Puharich for making that kind of control and mind fuckery a reality. Still, there's value in man's words. He was a brilliant researcher. He knew where the bodies were buried, so to speak. As he tells it, this book got him into a lot of trouble with the CIA and it was never officially published. We received this copy from the state of one of Puharich's close friends and feel that the information contained herein is so shocking, so important, and so relevant to what's happening now that we needed to offer it to serious researchers. It paints a vastly different picture of what Nikola Tesla was up to, what has become of his research in the past 90 years, and the current abysmal attacks on free will befalling all of humanity.
Couldn't have said it better. Couldn't have said it better myself. And that Tesla connection is really interesting. The another one who's that Andy Jacobson names as being part of the Roundtable Foundation was is it Jack Hayes Hammond? It's like John Jack Hayes Hammond or something like that. But he invented the first radio controlled torpedo for the Navy, and he had actually studied under Nikola Tesla and I believe Thomas Edison, but Hammond Jr. was a huge influence on Puharich at the Roundtable Foundation and brought a lot of this like Tesla ideas about electricity. And like I said, he was studying, kind of bioelectricity. He was studying the interface between, he was, studying the electrobiology of the brain is primarily, where his specialty as a scientist lay. So there's that.
Chris Knowles. Yeah, I've had him on a couple of times, guys. You can look through there. Look up Dean Radin, too. Noetic science is an important component of all this stuff. It all overlaps, just like Puharich overlaps with so many people. I have another discussion at 5 and 45 minutes. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed, Dave?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think did the best we could to cover, kind of the range of, kind of Puharich's life. It's, tough to touch everything in an hour and a half, but I think, we gave it a good go. And
he's so important. He's real. I mean, I saw him on the Nephilim Death Cult podcast. Saw him on the Biblical Hitman, but not many other places do they go kind of try to really unpack him. Maybe I've done a lot on Leary, but Puharich is an important piece of the puzzle. No question about it.
Yeah, the Nonsense Bazaar is a podcast, and they have a really good Puharich series. It's 3-part, but yeah, I mean he's not talked about as much as Gottlieb. He's not talked about as much as these other MK Ultra guys, and that's partly because he wasn't. Like I said, there was kind of this differentiation between Project Artichoke and MK Ultra, and just last kind of point on that is what's interesting is when all that stuff about the CIA and the mind control programs was coming out in the 70s, the people that kind of gave the press, they needed to give them something because so many questions were being asked. So it was Dick Cheney and Richard Helms were the aides of Gerald Ford that advised the CIA, okay, we can tell them something about MK Ultra because there's that institutional buffer. But since Puharich wasn't part of that, his name never really got raised in that conversation. So I think he's getting a lot more attention in the last 10 or 15 years. The Levinda book was published in 2011, and it has a decent section on it. But yeah, I still think that there is a wealth of study to be had, kind of on his life.
Dave, where can people find your stuff? Substack and your podcast, right?
Yeah, so our publishing business is Hemispheric Press, and that is the name of our Substack. So hemispheric.substack.com. And then we have a podcast that is attached to that. That is called Bad Press, where we look at a lot of these different kind of things. You can buy my business partner's books if you are interested. One is called God's Eye View, and it is about the physics of consciousness, and the next one that he wrote was about the Shroud of Turin. So it's called Shroud Pilled. That's his most recent one. Talks about a really interesting kind of scientific analysis that's happened around the Shroud of Turin. And yeah, like I said, go check us out at Bad Press.
Cool. Bad Press and Hemispheric Press. And the guest today was David Smith. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Yeah. And thank you to all your listeners.